Imagine it's 1951. In the cold, vast landscape of Greenland, something is stirring that isn't just about the weather or politics, it's about the very soul of a people. At that time, the Danish government had this idea, a project they thought was visionary, but looking back, it feels more like a ghost story. They wanted to modernize Greenland, and they figured the best way to do that wasn't by building roads or hospitals alone, but by re-engineering human beings. They decided to take a small group of Inuit children, bring them to Denmark, and turn them into a new elite. The goal was to transform these kids into perfect little Europeans who would eventually go back and lead their people into a Danish future. It sounds like a social science experiment because, well, that's exactly what it was. But these weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were 22 children, some as young as 6 years old, with families who loved them. The government went to the parents with these golden promises. They told them their children would get the best education imaginable, that they'd live a life of privilege, and that it was a huge honor for their families. But they didn't mention the fine print. They didn't say that this education required a total erasure of who these children were. When those 22 kids arrived in Denmark, the world they knew just vanished. They were placed in foster homes and orphanages where their mother tongue was strictly forbidden. Think about that for a second, being 6 years old in a strange foreign country and being told that the only way you know how to say, "I'm scared," or "I miss my mom," is now illegal. They were dressed in Danish clothes, taught Danish manners, and molded into a version of themselves that their own parents wouldn't even recognize. The real tragedy, though, started in 1952, when the experiment moved to its next phase, the homecoming. You'd think that after a year away, these children would be rushed back into the arms of their mothers and fathers, right? But the government had a different plan. When they landed back in Greenland, they weren't sent home. Instead, they were put into a Red Cross orphanage in the capital, Nuuk. They were kept in a sort of cultural quarantine. By this point, most of them had completely forgotten how to speak Greenlandic. Imagine the scene at the gates, parents showing up to see their children, only to realize they couldn't even talk to each other. The kids looked like their parents, but they spoke the language of the colonizer. They were strangers in their own birthplace, viewed by the local community as outsiders or the government's pets. They were stuck in a vacuum, belonging nowhere. As the years went by, the elite the government hoped for never materialized. Instead, the weight of that experiment crushed almost everyone involved. These children grew up in a permanent state of limbo. They weren't Danish enough for Denmark, and they were no longer Greenlandic enough for Greenland. That kind of identity crisis does something to a person's spirit. As they hit adulthood, the statistics became devastating. Most of them struggled with deep depression and severe alcoholism. Half of those 22 children passed away before they even reached middle age, many by their own hand. One of the survivors later described it perfectly, saying they were just chess pieces on a board, moved around by a government that just wanted to prove its own theories right. It wasn't about the children, it was about the ego of an empire. For decades, this story was buried. The Danish government stayed silent, perhaps hoping time would just wash the memory away. But history has a way of staying loud. It wasn't until 2020, nearly 70 years later, that the Prime Minister of Denmark finally stood up, with tears in her eyes, and offered a formal apology to the few survivors left. She admitted that while they couldn't change the past, they had to take responsibility for it. A couple of years later, they even paid out some compensation. But if you talk to the people who lived through it, they'll tell you that no amount of money can buy back a stolen childhood or a lost language. It's a haunting reminder of what happens when good intentions are used as an excuse to strip away human dignity. It shows us that the most dangerous kind of cruelty is often the kind that thinks it's doing you a favor.